it's said that the surgeon changes the dressings while God heals the wound. But how is this healing accomplished? Let's look at a piece of skin. Your squamous epithelium that lines the skin is known as your epidermis. Underneath that is a layer of connective tissue that's known as the dermis. The epidermis and dermis together make up the skin. Underneath that is a layer of adipose tissue that's known as the subcutis. Now let's imagine that some type of injury, maybe a surgical incision or some other type of injury, causes a relatively circumscribed, a relatively localized injury or separation of the skin here. So things are relatively close. Nothing's been widely separated. In this case, healing can proceed by a process that's called primary intention. The main point about healing by primary intention is that you could have direct healing, direct regeneration of the tissue as it was originally made by epithelial to epithelial approximation. So in this context, what's going to happen is epithelial cells from the injured area will grow, and epithelial cells from the other injured point will grow, and they'll come to contact each other. This is called direct regeneration. Because the tissue that was damaged, your epithelium, is close enough, your two cut ends, to directly approximate each other and touch and heal the gap. The gap isn't big enough that anything more is required. Direct regeneration. If the cut extended a little deeper, you will have the initial inflammatory mediators in the area. You'll find some neutrophils that come in. After some time, the neutrophils, after about a day, the neutrophil population will die back a little, and your next population that will come on scene will be your macrophages. Your macrophages call another cell, macrophages are there from about 3 days to a week. Within several days, another cell population comes on site. And don't forget, inflammation and repair are intimately related, and you can't have one without the other, and your inflammation calls your repair process. So the next thing that comes on are these fibroblastic cells, and the fibroblastic cells also call blood vessels in the process of angiogenesis. The fibroblasts lay down first some proteoglycans, which is what we call in pathology ground substance, which are big branching sugar structures with a little bit of protein. And eventually structural proteins such as collagen gets deposited. And when the collagen gets deposited in a plane that's parallel to the plane of the skin, that really increases the tensile strength. And at that time, within several weeks, you now have good healing. Sometimes the collagen could be very strongly deposited, and then you have a scar. Now, what would be to happen if the injury was more extensive and it took out a big gouge of the skin? How could the body then heal and recover from this? So imagine here we have our two lines here, and this all in the middle now is a gap. This is your gap. Well, in this case, unfortunately, the gap here is too far to be healed by direct regeneration. When the gap is that big, the body undergoes a second process that's called secondary intention. In secondary intention, the first thing that you could imagine that happens is you have blood vessels here and blood vessels here and little capillaries, and everything becomes leaky because of inflammatory mediators, because of the neutrophils, I'm showing in green, the macrophages, they come on site, inflammatory mediators such as complement, arachidonic acid mediators, and kinins and histamine, and ultimately your capillaries become leaky, and they undergo a type of leak that's not only transudative but exudative. Protein is lost, and protein and fibrin fills up the gap. So the first thing that will happen is you'll get an exudate. You will get an exudate of protein and fibrin. And that usually occurs within hours, up to around 24 hours. You get this exudate of protein and fibrin in the gap. At this point in the process, say about 24 hours have elapsed, you've got your neutrophils, and then your neutrophil population begins to fade a little bit, and within a day or two, who comes in but your macrophages, and then the macrophages start to populate, and they even populate this fibrin exudate, and that's within days. And then the macrophages, this macrophage and population, inflammatory population within the fibrin, because of the mediator's release, they call two other very important cells in. One population of cells that they call in are fibroblasts, and another population of cells that they call in are blood vessel cells, or they call blood vessel, your angiogenesis. And now you've got young fibroblasts, and young fibroblasts, what they tend to lay down, what young fibroblasts tend to lay down is a loose substance that we call ground substance. And these young fibroblasts lay down the ground substance, and you could sort of see them. They lay down this loose ground substance, which are proteoglycans, which are things like heparan sulfate, keratan sulfate, similar to mucins, really. And in addition, this milieu calls in new blood vessel formation, and that's angiogenesis. And the angiogenesis could either be taking branches off pre-existing vessels, which is called secondary angiogenesis, or new blood vessels can actually form de novo in here, and that's called, and then hook up with outside vessels, and that's called primary angiogenesis. But this substance here, which is your myxoid material laid down by the young fibroblasts, which are your proteoglycans, plus your new vessels, what that equals is granulation tissue. And your granulation tissue, as we said before, often has a lot of inflammatory cells, lymphocytes, macrophages, maybe the odd neutrophil, and that is your inflamed granulation tissue, but it's productively inflamed, that's forming within this scar. The next thing that happens over time, this granulation tissue starts to recede a little bit. And instead, but not as dramatically as it's being shown in this animation. And instead, what now starts to come in, the population of cells, are older fibroblasts. And your fibroblasts now, instead of making so much ground substance, instead of making so much proteoglycans, they shift their production. And they start to make collagen. And ultimately, the collagen over time, so now we're moving beyond a week, the collagen begins to become deposited more and more parallel to the plane of the skin. And you start, and by the way, for those who want the technical information in this area, you could get thinning of the overlying epidermis, and I'll get into that. And you also lose your adnexal structures, like your hair structures. And now you're starting to form a denser scar. And the denser scar has quite a lot of collagen in it. And then something sort of magical happens. There's a special kind of fibroblasts that acquires properties that's a little bit like muscle. The fibroblasts develop the kind of cytoskeleton elements that allow the fibroblast to contract. And that kind of fibroblast is called a myo, as in muscle, a myofibroblast, a contractile fibroblast. And that'll happen after about a week, even between 1 week and 2 weeks. And what the fibroblasts do is heave ho, and they begin bringing the edges together. They contract, and they contract the scar, and things come closer together. Well, what happens in that context, lo and behold, is that these two edges of skin that were so far apart previously are now brought closer together. They're now brought closer together. And slowly they inch closer together, and regeneration occurs, and they could actually heal. but it never heals quite perfectly, and you're always left with a little bit of change in the density of the dermal collagen, and that's the scar, and the scar sometimes attenuates or thins the overlying epithelium, and that's what we appreciate as a scar. And a surgeon could diminish scarring by diminishing the amount of secondary intention that they have by bringing the two ends together artificially, such as by using sutures. So basically that's just what I wanted to cover here. In the context of the healing of skin, the difference between primary intention and secondary intention. Thank you so much.